I'm Lee Toast, Associate Professor and Vice Dean for MBA programs at USC Marshall.
And I'm doctoral candidate Jacob Roberson. And we've been researching how narratives, that is the stories we tell ourselves to explain our social experiences, how these narratives help us understand why people feel discriminated against, and how different narratives ultimately lead to different psychological outcomes.
This research was actually inspired by what was, to us, a surprising finding in data I was collecting for another research project. That surprising finding was that a lot of men, increasing numbers over recent years, were reporting gender discrimination. And this was surprising to us because in this other research project, the whole author team were women. And we kept saying to each other, what are these men talking about when they say they're experiencing gender discrimination? I mean, when we thought of gender discrimination, we thought of the typical story of a woman feeling undermined at work because someone assumed she wasn't smart enough or strong enough or wasn't leadership material. We thought of the typical patriarchal story. That was the narrative in our heads. But we thought that can't be what the men in these data are talking about.
Right. Imagine you're talking with a man and he tells you he's experienced gender discrimination at work. What do you imagine he's referring to? What type of experience would lead him to say this? Our hunch was the things that men in that data were talking about probably had nothing to do with patriarchal assumptions about gender norms. The narrative they were using to make sense of their experiences was probably, we thought, totally different.
So we wondered, when men and women say something like, I just experienced gender discrimination, what are the similarities and differences in the social experiences they're referring to, and how do the psychological impacts of those stories differ? We began with the assumption that both groups define the term gender discrimination in the same way. That is, it refers to unfair treatment based on one's gender. But what type of unfair treatment? To help us theorize these ideas, we drew on narrative identity theory, which tells us that people use stories to make sense of their lives.
And we argued that when it comes to gender discrimination, there are likely to be two different cultural narratives about where discrimination comes from for women versus men. For example, the patriarchal narrative that Lee described a moment ago views gender discrimination as emerging from deep-seated stereotypes in which women are viewed as less capable and agentic than men, and as less suitable for leadership roles.
Give her to somebody else. I ask for a man. But I can remember the good old days when there were all men in my department.
So, from this perspective, a woman who feels discriminated against based on gender might point to stereotypical expectations for women to stay in supporting roles and to assist others, rather than to move out front and lead.
However, for men, the narrative is different. You've likely heard the term reverse discrimination. It refers to a sense that efforts to reduce discrimination against one group lead to a new form of discrimination against another group. So we predicted that when men say, yeah, I've experienced gender discrimination, this is what they're referring to. They're not talking about having to do stereotypically masculine things like, say, carry heavy things. Instead, they're talking about feeling sidelined by initiatives that are aimed at reducing discrimination against women.
And importantly, we theorized that cultural narratives shape how men and women react psychologically to feeling discriminated against. For women, the message of the patriarchal narrative is that women are not sufficiently capable and lack leadership skills. This message can lead women to feel reduced self-efficacy due to the skills-based implications of the narrative, and can also lead women to feel a lower sense of belonging because they feel devalued.
But in that environment, kind of a real aggressive meeting environment, I didn't shine. And I thought at one point, I'm just going to drop out. I don't know, I don't think I'm going to be successful in this field. And my manager at the time said, don't do that. How can we fix things? And I said, well, just, throw me the ball now and then. I have something to say, but it's hard to interject.
For men, the effects are different because the narrative is different. For men, the dominant narrative is that they're being penalized not due to their own skills or abilities, but simply in order to provide a relative advantage to women. As a result, the men are also likely to feel devalued because of this experience, but we didn't expect any effect on their self-efficacy because they shouldn't see the discrimination as having anything to do with their perceived competence.
To better understand these varying narratives and to test our predictions, we conducted a series of 5 studies. surveying over 3,000 adults. We aim to gather both qualitative and quantitative data about people's experiences with perceived gender discrimination in the workplace.
In our first study, we asked participants if they had personally ever experienced workplace discrimination because of their gender. If they had, they were asked to describe what happened. In our sample, 38% of women and 14% of men reported having experienced gender discrimination, and they described a personal experience. If they answered no to that first question, though, we asked if they knew anyone of their same gender who had such an experience. And if they answered no to that, we asked them to imagine someone of their same gender experiencing gender discrimination.
The responses we gathered in Study 1 were coded based on the narratives participants provided about the discrimination, and the results were consistent with our predictions. Women mostly appealed to patriarchal narratives, whereas men mostly discussed situations of reverse discrimination.
From there, we tested the validity and prevalence of these narratives and their downstream psychological consequences in 4 additional studies.
In line with our predictions, for women, perceived gender discrimination significantly reduced their self-efficacy, whereas for men, self-efficacy was not affected by perceived gender discrimination. Both genders, however, experienced diminished belonging in response to perceived gender discrimination.
So why does all this matter? One of the most fundamental contributions of this research is that men and women mean fundamentally different things when they say, "I've experienced gender discrimination." Up until now, researchers have used scales to measure something called perceived gender discrimination, and they've administered the scales to men and women, assuming the scales are measuring the same thing. Our findings show that this assumption is incorrect. Women and men are referring to fundamentally different social experiences when they speak about experiencing gender discrimination, and using a single scale can't capture that complexity.
Absolutely. That's why it's important to understand the stories people tell about their social experiences and perceptions. It's these stories that drive how people internalize and react to discrimination, which in turn can affect their well-being, motivation, and sense of identity at work. Our research shows that cultural narratives play a pivotal role here. These narratives help people make sense of why they feel vulnerable to discrimination, and it's this why that determines the psychological impact. Without narratives, we argue that you can't fully grasp the effects of perceived discrimination.
We hope our findings will encourage scholars and organizational leaders alike to look beyond the quantitative aspects of measuring discrimination and explore the substantive meanings that people assign to their experiences.
To do this, we recommend listening to employees, their stories, their experiences, their perceptions, and suggestions. Conducting employee surveys simply isn't enough. Talking to your employees is one of the most effective things organizational leaders can do to understand employee stories and experiences to help intervene and establish a healthy and productive work environment.